Echoes of the Abyss. The descent begins. It started as a thrill-seeking expedition. Deep-sea divers Richard, Emma, and Lucas had ventured into the Atlantic, off the coast of an abandoned, old whaling village. There, tales had circulated for generations about strange occurrences, whispers carried by the currents, and shadows moving within the ocean's depths. Yet, the lure of exploration outweighed the ominous legends. The three prepared their equipment, voices muffled with excitement as they lowered themselves into the unknown. As the sun set, casting a fiery glow across the water, their vessel, the Hydra, creaked, as if warning them of the dangers beneath. But the divers barely noticed, their gaze fixed on the black water stretching before them. "All right, here we go," Lucas murmured, adjusting his headlamp as they submerged into the icy grip of the ocean. As they descended, the light from the surface began to fade, replaced by an oppressive darkness. The silence, broken only by the faint hum of their equipment, grew more intense, as if the ocean itself was listening. Depth markers on their screens showed they had crossed 500 meters, but there was no sign of the sea bed. It was as if they were falling forever. "I'm getting a strange reading here," Emma's voice crackled through the comms. "Are you guys seeing this?" Richard and Lucas checked their gauges. Emma was right. Below them, a massive structure began to appear on the sonar, a sprawling formation hidden in the dark. As they descended further, the outlines of a massive, ancient structure emerged, a ruin half buried in the ocean floor, covered in an eerie, blue-tinged algae. It looked like a temple or some colossal gateway, with twisted pillars and carvings of strange symbols that pulsed faintly. It was unlike anything they had ever seen or heard of, a structure that seemed to have survived centuries in the dark. I don't think we're supposed to be here," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Ignoring the gnawing fear, they moved closer, their lights casting long shadows over the ominous carvings. Then, as if awakening, a low hum reverberated from within the structure, a haunting, rhythmic sound that chilled them to their core. Lucas noticed a narrow passageway hidden among the shadows at the base of the temple. "We should check this out," he suggested, though unease crept into his voice. Without waiting for confirmation, he moved forward, with Richard and Emma reluctantly following. The tunnel was pitch black, the silence within absolute. Their headlamps barely pierced the darkness, and every step seemed to deepen the heavy, stifling atmosphere. Suddenly, faint whispers echoed around them, distorted by the water. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, resentful, and chillingly human. I think it's coming from below us," Richard whispered, his voice wavering. The whispers grew louder, as if the walls themselves were speaking, revealing secrets meant to stay buried. As the divers ventured deeper into the passage, the tunnel walls seemed to close in, covered with strange, pulsating growths that almost looked alive. Emma paused, touching one of the slimy patches. To her horror, it seemed to shiver under her hand, as if recoiling from her touch. They exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of isolation pressing down on them. The darkness was so consuming, so final, that they felt trapped, not just by the ocean, but by something watching them. A series of carvings lined the walls, grotesque images of twisted faces, eyes wide in terror, mouths agape in silent screams. The whispers, once a faint murmur, became a crescendo of agonized cries echoing around them. Are they saying something?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. The whispers coalesced, forming something more coherent, chilling them to their bones. Turn back, turn back." But they couldn't turn back. The walls seemed to press tighter with each step, guiding them deeper, as though the tunnel had come alive and was swallowing them whole. They finally emerged into a vast, domed chamber that seemed to defy explanation. In the center lay a monolithic stone altar, upon which rested a mirror-like pool of black water, so still that it reflected their lights in perfect clarity. Suddenly, a shadow flickered across the pool's surface, taking the shape of a human figure before dispersing into darkness. Richard, unnerved, turned to leave, only to realize that the tunnel they had come through was now sealed. They were trapped. Then, from the corners of the chamber, shadows began to coalesce, forming into indistinct figures that slowly crawled along the walls, their faces devoid of any features except hollow, black pits for eyes. They stared directly at the divers, as if expecting them, their presence a silent warning. Emma's breathing grew shallow, and she gripped her equipment tighter. "This can't be real," she whispered, watching in horror as one of the shadowy figures extended a hand, pointing toward the altar. "Are they inviting us?" Lucas asked, his voice filled with dread. Despite every instinct to flee, an unexplainable compulsion drew them forward. As they approached the altar, the black pool of water began to ripple, revealing flashes of images within its depths, visions of shipwrecks, screaming sailors, and ancient civilizations drowned in darkness. Each image was accompanied by a guttural wail that reverberated throughout the chamber. Emma let out a horrified gasp as a face suddenly appeared in the water, staring directly at her, a twisted, waterlogged visage that seemed alive. It mouthed silent words, begging for release, before melting back into the darkness. Lucas, entranced by the visions, leaned closer to the pool, his eyes wide. "It's showing us something," but before he could reach in, a hand, cold and clammy as death, wrapped around his wrist, yanking him down. The others rushed to pull him back, and with a struggle, he was freed, but not before a dark bruise appeared on his wrist, a mark that seemed to pulse as if alive. The chamber began to shake violently, and the walls shifted, transforming into a network of winding corridors and endless staircases leading deeper into the ocean's heart. Emma, Lucas, and Richard realized they were now in a labyrinth, a maze designed to disorient and trap. As they moved through the twisted passages, bizarre occurrences heightened their terror. At one turn, Emma glimpsed what appeared to be herself, her own figure standing at the end of the hall, grinning maliciously before vanishing. Richard heard voices calling his name, sounding eerily like his mother's voice. Though she had been dead for years, he clutched his head, fighting the psychological onslaught. "We're going to lose our minds in here." The labyrinth grew darker, with walls coated in thick layers of ancient marine growth. Horrific faces seemed to emerge from the algae, their eyes pleading as if trapped in eternal torment. Lucas, now visibly shaken, confessed, I think I can hear them whispering in my mind." The whispers grew more aggressive, threatening to drive them mad. The walls seemed to pulse, and every step they took echoed back at them, as if mocking their attempts to escape. With each moment, the shadows grew bolder, slithering across the walls and floor, closing in on them. Richard reached out, only to watch his hand pass through one of them, a searing coldness spreading through his fingers. His breath caught as he realized the shadows weren't just images, they were remnants, souls of those who had died in this cursed place, seeking escape but forever chained to the abyss. Finally, they arrived at the heart of the labyrinth, a cavernous room where the water pooled from every direction, creating an otherworldly mirror that filled the room with a sinister, dark light. At the center stood a figure, tall and ancient, its face hidden beneath a hood, its eyes like two endless voids. It raised a skeletal hand, beckoning them forward. This is what's been calling us," Lucas stammered, his voice trembling with horror. The figure's mouth opened, revealing a maw of sharp, gleaming teeth. "Join us," it whispered in a guttural voice, echoing through the cavern. The divers felt an irresistible pull, as if their very souls were being drawn toward the being. As they journeyed deeper, the feeling of something vast and ancient lurking just beyond the reach of their flashlights grew palpable. Each time they thought they saw movement in the shadows, the beams would reveal only the still, dark water around them. But they all sensed it, their every move was being watched. Suddenly, a creature glided silently past, just barely within sight. Its form was like nothing any of them had seen before, a nightmarish fusion of scales and shadow with gleaming, lidless eyes. Richard froze, his breath catching in his throat. Did anyone else see that? Before anyone could respond, more of the creatures began to materialize around them, slithering and silent. They seemed drawn to the divers, circling slowly. When one came close, its eyes locked onto Emma, unblinking and filled with a cold intelligence that sent a shiver down her spine. She felt her body freeze as though paralyzed, her mind caught in those hollow eyes. For a moment, she felt it not as an animal, but as a being, something ancient, aware, and hungry. As they continued, the divers became aware of a low, rhythmic chant reverberating through the water, too deep and haunting to be of human origin. The sound seemed to come from within the rock itself, vibrating through the water, penetrating their minds. The voices began to form into coherent whispers, some familiar, others in languages they couldn't understand. Emma flinched when she heard her own voice echo back at her from the darkness, saying words she had never spoken. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas, disturbed, glanced around, as if the source of the whisper was right beside him. "It's like it's reading us." The walls around them began to change, with symbols appearing that glowed faintly in the murky water. Some appeared to be warnings, while others seemed to show scenes of sacrifice and suffering, a history of the abyss they now descended through. The corridor led them to a vast underwater hall, its ceiling lost in shadows. Stalactites hung down, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like faces, twisted in agony. Suddenly, a voice boomed through the cavern, a distorted, mocking laughter. It echoed endlessly, becoming a cacophony of taunts and jeers. In the middle of the hall lay a vast stone altar, covered in dark stains. Lucas took a step forward, only for the ground beneath him to open slightly. Swallowing his leg, he cried out, but the more he struggled, the tighter it held him. Emma and Richard tried to pull him free, but every tug seemed to sink him deeper, like the ocean itself was pulling him into the ground. Just as they thought they might lose him, a force suddenly released him, sending him sprawling onto the floor. As he scrambled up, he turned to see something deeply unsettling, a handprint in the stone floor, large and skeletal, right where his leg had been trapped. The divers pressed on, entering what appeared to be an ancient nesting ground of some long-dead creature, its massive skeletal remains partially embedded in the rock around them. The skull alone was taller than any of them, its eye sockets large enough to crawl through. The bones gave off a faint bioluminescent glow, casting eerie shadows. Lucas pointed to strange, dark shapes attached to the creature's spine, small, pulsing sacs that looked almost alive. As he stepped closer to examine them, one of the sacs burst, releasing a swarm of small, jellyfish-like entities that glowed in ominous red. They darted towards the divers, encircling them. As the creatures brushed against their suits, they emitted a shock, causing intense pain that felt like ice-cold needles driving into their skin. Emma screamed as one brushed against her neck, and the glow around them intensified, as if sensing their fear. With no other choice, the divers dashed out of the lair, the jellyfish-like entities following them until the light finally faded, disappearing back into the abyss. They soon found themselves in a labyrinthine network of narrow underwater paths that opened into small, dark pools. The water in each was so still, it reflected like a mirror, creating an eerie maze of endless reflections. As they moved forward, their reflections in the pools began to distort, revealing warped versions of themselves, faces twisted in fear, eyes wide with terror. Richard looked down and saw his own face, mouth agape in a silent scream. Lucas dared to reach down and touch the water, and immediately, the pool shifted, showing him visions of past divers who had entered the abyss and never returned. They watched as scenes unfolded of people lost, wandering aimlessly, until shadows overtook them, dragging them into the darkness. Their own faces then appeared, showing futures they couldn't bear to look at, visions of themselves, trapped, screaming, as shadows consumed them. The horrifying clarity left them shaken and desperate, but they pressed on, each pool more disturbing than the last. At the end of the tunnel, they reached an enormous stone gate, guarded by a towering figure cloaked in the shadows of the ocean. The creature's face was featureless, yet its presence was overwhelming, exuding an aura of malice that paralyzed them. The creature extended a bony, clawed hand, beckoning them closer. In a voice that sounded like 1,000 souls speaking at once, it whispered, "To leave this place, a price must be paid." The divers exchanged terrified glances. What price?" Richard managed to ask. The creature didn't answer but opened its hand to reveal a single, dark pearl, pulsating with a strange energy. Lucas reached out instinctively, but Emma held him back. "Don't," she whispered, sensing that whatever they were about to accept would bind them forever to the darkness. But the creature grew impatient, and its shadowy form began to stretch and grow, enveloping the room in a suffocating darkness. They had no choice. Lucas took the pearl, and as soon as he touched it, a searing pain shot through his body, as if his very life force was being drained. With the pearl in hand, the gate slowly opened, revealing another tunnel that led even deeper into the abyss. Emma, Lucas, and Richard had no choice but to continue, their energy sapped but driven by the faint hope of escape. As they entered, the walls of the tunnel pulsed with a life of their own, beating in sync with the pearl's ominous glow. They could feel it, the abyss was awake, watching, waiting. Shapes began to form in the walls, faces that seemed to be alive, eyes following their every move. With each step, the air grew colder, the shadows darker, until they could no longer see anything but the faint glow of the pearl and the walls pulsing around them. It was as if the tunnel had swallowed them, consuming them inch by inch, and they knew, deep down, that they were nearing the heart of something ancient and unspeakable. The tunnel led them to a vast, circular chamber with walls that seemed to be carved from the very bones of the earth. The chamber pulsed with a faint glow, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls in grotesque shapes, almost as if they were alive. Emma was the first to notice faint whispers echoing throughout the chamber, almost imperceptible at first, but they grew louder the closer they moved to the chamber's center. Faces, twisted in agony and despair, appeared and vanished in the walls, each one mouthing silent screams. This is a graveyard," Richard murmured, horror filling his voice. Lucas approached the center of the room, drawn to a strange, altar-like structure. As he looked closer, he saw that the surface was covered in carvings, symbols, and small, engraved faces that seemed to shift, each one showing a new expression of terror every few moments. Without warning, the altar emitted a piercing shriek, and each face turned to look directly at them, the dead eyes filled with a suffering that sent shivers down their spines. The room filled with a howling wind that seemed to come from nowhere, and with it came the voices. "Leave us, save us," the voices whispered, overlapping one another, forming an eerie chorus. Shadows began to creep along the floor, moving with a sentient, hungry force, reaching out to them like hands grasping at prey. The shadowy figure from the gate reappeared, its eyes now gleaming with a sinister light. It raised a bony hand, pointing towards Lucas, as if singling him out. "A price must be paid," it repeated, its voice echoing, filled with malice and impatience. Emma and Richard stepped back, fear etched into their faces, but Lucas, drawn by some unseen force, took a step toward the creature, his expression vacant, as though hypnotized. "No, Lucas. Don't!" Emma screamed, trying to pull him back, but an invisible force seemed to hold her and Richard in place. The creature reached out, and with a single touch on Lucas's chest, a dark, inky substance began to seep from his skin, as though it were drawing something vital from him. His eyes rolled back, and his body convulsed, the life draining from him as he collapsed onto the cold, stone floor. Just as Emma and Richard's horror reached its peak, Lucas's body started to rise again, but now his eyes were hollow, filled with an unnatural light. He looked at them, his face expressionless, yet there was something profoundly wrong, an emptiness that had taken root inside him. The creature gestured to the now open passage behind them, urging them forward with a silent demand. Lucas, Emma, and Richard continued onward, now trapped in an endless series of dark, narrow tunnels. The air grew colder, each breath coming harder, heavier. Their flashlights began to flicker, casting intermittent light on the grotesque carvings lining the walls, creatures with eyes too large, limbs too long, mouths open in eternal screams. Every now and then, one of the carvings seemed to shift slightly, as if caught in the act of moving when they weren't looking. Emma felt an icy hand grip her ankle, and she stumbled, nearly falling. Looking down, she saw the outline of a face forming in the dirt, its mouth moving silently, as if screaming for help. The deeper they went, the louder the heartbeat-like pulsing grew, as if the abyss itself had a heartbeat that throbbed in sync with the pearl Lucas held. But now, it seemed as though the abyss was waking, aware of the intruders within its domain. From the shadows, slithering creatures with translucent skin and hollow eyes began to emerge, crawling toward them. Emma tried to push past her fear, whispering, "We have to keep moving, whatever's down here, it wants us to stay." With every step, the ground beneath them seemed to breathe, swelling and contracting as if they were walking across the back of some slumbering giant. The slithering creatures grew bolder, moving closer, their cold, damp skin brushing against their legs, sending chills up their spines. At last, they reached an enormous pit, the depths of which were shrouded in darkness. In the center of the pit, a faint, glowing light flickered, a strange, otherworldly beacon that seemed to call to them. As they peered into the pit, ghostly figures began to rise from the depths, their forms hazy, eyes hollow, each figure whispering in a strange, rhythmic chant. The chanting grew louder, filling the room with a powerful, unearthly energy. Suddenly, the pit began to fill with a dark, viscous liquid, reaching out with tendrils that wrapped around Emma, Lucas, and Richard. The liquid felt like ice against their skin, burning and freezing at once, making every nerve in their bodies scream. Emma's mind was filled with visions, images of sailors, divers, and explorers trapped in the abyss, each one meeting a gruesome fate. The figures in the pit wailed, and the tendrils tightened, drawing them slowly toward the center. As they struggled, Lucas realized that the only way to escape was to cast the cursed pearl into the depths, but as he lifted it, the tendrils wrapped tighter, and the abyss itself seemed to resist, unwilling to let go of its prey. With a final surge of strength, Lucas hurled the pearl into the pit. There was a deafening roar as the abyss seemed to convulse, shadows writhing and churning like a living storm. The figures around them screamed, their voices merging into a single, soul-piercing cry of despair. The pit began to collapse in on itself, the chamber trembling as the walls fractured, sending waves of water crashing down. Emma and Richard grabbed Lucas, who seemed to be fading fast, and pulled him back, racing up the passageway as the abyss unleashed its fury behind them. But just as they thought they were free, the shadowy figure from before appeared, blocking their way, its form more monstrous and malevolent than ever. It let out a low growl, eyes gleaming with fury as it advanced, intent on keeping them within its cursed realm forever. With nothing left to lose, Emma faced the creature, her mind racing for a way to survive this final horror. With the abyssal chamber collapsing around them, the three survivors, Emma, Lucas, and Richard, fought their way through the rising tide of darkness, the slithering creatures biting at their ankles and clutching at their arms. The strange, spectral figures followed, whispering in a chilling cadence, "Stay, join us, become one with the abyss." Lucas was growing weaker by the moment, his face pale, eyes empty, and breath shallow. He clutched his chest, the spot where the creature's cold touch had lingered, as if something within him had been claimed by the abyss itself. The trio stumbled into a narrow corridor that led upward, a faint glimmer of light barely visible at the far end. It seemed to be their only way out, and despite the horrific sounds echoing behind them, they ran, feeling the weight of the abyss clawing at their backs. As they pressed forward, the light grew brighter, but with it came something even more terrifying. The walls of the corridor began to shift, showing reflections of their worst fears. Shadows of the creatures they had encountered slithered along the walls, and images of past divers, forever trapped and reaching out in silent screams, mirrored their every move. The light played tricks on their minds, and with each step, their reality grew more twisted. Lucas's breathing became heavier, and his grip on Emma's arm tightened as he whispered, "It's not letting me go. I feel it inside." Emma's heart raced, realizing that Lucas's struggle was not just with their physical environment but with a growing darkness within him. She watched in horror as his skin seemed to pale, his veins darkening, giving him a haunted, hollow appearance. They reached the end of the corridor, only to be confronted by a heavy iron door. In the middle of the door was a handprint, engraved into the cold metal, a subtle reminder that a sacrifice was required. Lucas stepped forward, looking at the handprint, his face filled with a strange sense of acceptance. He seemed to understand what the door was asking, and without a word, he placed his hand on the cold, engraved imprint. The door began to vibrate, and a low, ancient rumbling filled the chamber as it unlocked. Emma and Richard watched in horror as the darkness seemed to creep up Lucas's arm, binding him to the door. His body began to convulse, his eyes clouding with a murky, black film, yet he managed a faint, reassuring smile. "It's the only way out," he murmured, "go, before it takes you too." Emma's tears blurred her vision as she reached out, desperate to pull Lucas back, but he shook his head, the strength leaving him. "You have to make it out, don't look back." As the door creaked open, a blinding light burst forth, illuminating the path to freedom. Emma and Richard, both fighting the anguish and guilt, forced themselves to move forward, each step tearing at their hearts. Behind them, Lucas's figure began to fade into the darkness, becoming one with the abyss as he offered his life for their escape. The two survivors found themselves in a narrow tunnel, the light guiding them upward, but the voices of the abyss grew louder, filling their minds with maddening echoes. Shadows flickered along the walls, sometimes appearing as Lucas's face, twisted in agony and hollow-eyed, as if trapped within the abyss itself. Emma stumbled, feeling an overwhelming weight of dread, but Richard urged her forward, saying, "He wouldn't want us to stop now. We have to honor his sacrifice." The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to crawl, the air growing thinner and colder. As they moved, the light began to fade, replaced by a haunting red glow that filled the space with an unnatural warmth. They knew they were close, but the abyss was not willing to let them go so easily. Just as they reached the final stretch, a force began pulling them backward, an invisible, powerful grip dragging them away from the light. The walls around them pulsed, as though alive, and spectral hands emerged from the stone, clutching at their limbs, faces, and clothes. Emma screamed, trying to push forward, but the grip was relentless. The voices returned, whispering in Lucas's tone, "Stay with me, don't leave." Emma's heart wrenched, and she nearly faltered, until Richard grabbed her arm, pulling her with every ounce of strength he had left. "It's trying to use him against us, we have to keep going." With a final push, they burst free from the grip of the spectral hands, dragging themselves out of the tunnel and collapsing onto the cold stone ground above. As Emma and Richard emerged from the narrow tunnel, the endless expanse of the ocean depths greeted them, pressing in with a chilling weight. Far from the light and air of the surface, the dark waters surrounding them felt as oppressive as ever, whispering of their past losses and promising more. They knew they had to get back to the ship anchored just beyond the tunnel's reach. With every step toward the submerged passages, a looming terror haunted their minds. They were not alone. Each shadow flickered with ominous promise, each shift in the water felt like a taunting reminder of the creature waiting, watching, somewhere in the dark. "Don't look back," Richard whispered, his voice wavering with fear. Emma nodded, her breath shaky, but the silence was short-lived, broken by a bone-chilling growl that echoed through the water, sending waves of fear through their bodies. The creature surged forward from the darkness behind them, its form obscured by a shifting blackness that seemed to absorb every beam of light. Massive, twisting, and filled with ancient malice, it closed in as Emma and Richard broke into a frenzied sprint toward the next cavern passage, stumbling as they pushed themselves to their limits. The passage narrowed, forcing them to dive through the jagged rocks and tunnels, the creature close behind. With each twist and turn, they could feel the monster's dark gaze and the surge of water it stirred in its wake. Richard, his face pale and eyes wide, urged Emma forward even as the creature's claws reached for him, brushing his arm with a cold that felt like death itself. "Run, Emma! Don't stop!" But just as they neared the last stretch to the final chamber, the creature lunged forward with terrifying speed, dragging Richard down into the depths. His scream cut through the water, haunting Emma as she scrambled toward the exit. She dared not look back, fighting every instinct to rescue her friend, knowing the sacrifice he had just made for her. Emma stumbled into the docking chamber where their ship awaited, moored in the water just ahead. Her body ached, lungs screaming for air, but she knew she had to keep moving. She climbed aboard, hands trembling as she reached for the controls, glancing over her shoulder to the still waters below. But the creature's silhouette was unmistakable in the darkness, its ominous shadow drifting closer to the surface, almost as if taunting her with the memory of her friends lost to its depths. As she fired up the engine, the vessel groaned and shuddered, and she steered it away, desperate to put as much distance as possible between her and that cursed abyss. The faint outline of the shore was barely visible beyond the ocean's horizon, her single lifeline in the vast sea of darkness, but every surge of water, every ripple, seemed to echo with the presence of the monster below. The boat surged forward, Emma clutching the wheel as tightly as she could, her heart pounding in her chest. The waves beat against the vessel, and with each passing second, the sense of dread grew stronger. She cast one last glance toward the open ocean, and her heart stopped. the creature had surfaced behind her, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly rage. In that moment, Emma felt the weight of every loss, every struggle, crash down upon her, and she screamed into the night as she pushed the engine to its limits, the shoreline growing ever closer. Her mind raced with fractured thoughts and images, her friends' faces, twisted in terror, the dark corridors of the abyss, and the creature's haunting gaze that would follow her for a lifetime. Finally, she felt the crunch of sand beneath the boat as it hit the shore. She leaped from the vessel, stumbling onto the sand, collapsing in exhaustion. She lay there, the ground solid and safe, grounding her in reality even as her mind reeled from the horrors she had faced. Emma rose slowly, brushing the wet sand from her arms, and turned to face the ocean. It looked peaceful, deceptively calm under the pale light of the rising sun, as if mocking her with its tranquility. She stood there, her body shaking with the weight of all she had endured, the horrors of the deep etched forever into her mind. A mixture of emotions swirled within her, relief at her survival, a hollow grief for the friends she had lost, and an aching fear that even now, the ocean held her captive, its shadows forever lurking in her memory. The haunting silence seemed to breathe in rhythm with her own heart, whispering of the lives claimed by the abyss and of the curse that would follow her as long as she lived. For just a moment, she thought she heard Richard's voice carried on the waves, a faint whisper of the past calling from beneath the surface, "It's never over." Emma turned and walked away from the shore, feeling the cold shadows of the ocean's depths lingering behind her, the curse of the abyss bound to her soul as she left that haunted coast behind, alive, but forever marked by the echoes of the darkness she had survived.